all of this. And
This meeting is being recorded.
so
Okay, perfect.
I'm here just to learn.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here. And as probably everyone just saw, we are also recording this meeting, and we will be sharing the link later for those who weren't able to be here. So with the next slide, we will, let's see, just some quick background on CRWA. We're a nonprofit organization founded in 1965 by a group of residents who wanted to see the Charles River cleaned up and did not accept the conventional wisdom at the time that it could not be cleaned up. We're about a dozen staff with scientists, an engineer, an attorney, communications and volunteer management folks with 4 program areas, river science, stormwater management, climate change adaptation or resilience, and also advocacy, outreach, and education. The watershed itself is 308 square miles. And I didn't come from a science background myself. All of the staff at CRWA are way smarter than I am. But one thing that I have learned, the big light bulb, is that basically the definition of a watershed, for those who aren't aware, is that wherever the water falls from rain, snow, etc., whatever water body that ends up in, that's your watershed. So even say a town like Holliston that's in the watershed, the river doesn't run through it. They may not feel that close to the watershed or the Charles River. However, land use decisions made in Holliston affect the health of the Charles River, as well as flooding impacts in other parts of the watershed that we're going to be talking about. So while there's 35 cities and towns in the watershed, there's only 23 cities and towns that have the river literally running through it. And there's close to 1 million people who live in our watershed. Interestingly, the river runs from south to north, which is kind of unusual. There are other rivers that do that, but it is a little bit unusual. Okay, so, oh, yes, we have 2 polls here tonight to kind of break things up. So we will do our first poll, and I know some of you don't have constituents, but that's okay. You can sort of think about who the people in your world are that talk about climate or climate related issues. So yeah, if you can answer that as best as you're able. How often do your constituents raise climate related issues? Very often, often, sometimes, or rarely. Okay, so got 3 responses, and yeah, we're getting up there, so kind of a mix. We've got some rarely as some very often. So we clearly all hang out with different crowds. So that's helpful, kind of a range there. Okay, and then let's go to the next question. How familiar are you with the Massachusetts Small Municipal Separate Stormwater, or MS4 general permit? This is foreshadowing. We will be talking about this more. So we've got some very familiar, somewhat familiar. Okay, well, that's good. Sometimes we do these and people aren't really familiar at all. So that's really great. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Just quick defining our terms. When we're talking about climate change action, there's really sort of 2 main buckets, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is prevention, like stopping the burning of fossil fuels in the first place by switching to clean energy. And I know that Franklin is deep in that conversation. I've been reading about your goal to set a net zero plan, for example, which is awesome. The other bucket is adaptation, or responding to the changes that are already baked in, such as heat, flooding, storms, etc. And that's more what we're going to be talking about today. There are some things that, like planting trees, which are both. When you have more trees, you protect against flooding and heat and air pollution, but trees also sequester carbon. So they're also a mitigation strategy. For the next slide, I'm sure I don't need to spend a lot of time on explaining to anyone here that climate change is real, but I do think of all the charts, this one is pretty vivid, and it shows that for hundreds of thousands of years, well before Homo sapiens even started walking on the planet, we had a pretty narrow band of carbon dioxide levels that were on Earth. And then with the Industrial Revolution, and then you can see where the line points to 1950, and then where we are today, the levels have really skyrocketed. So literally there have never been human beings on the planet with the levels of carbon dioxide where they are today, and they're just rising. So we are sort of living in a big chemistry experiment. Next one. In terms of climate impacts, there are a lot of impacts all over the world that we're seeing, fires and mudslides and famine and so forth. Here in the Northeast, what climate science tells us is we are going to be seeing extreme precipitation, recurrent flooding, and I know many of us have already been seeing this, heat and heat-related deaths. There's actually more deaths from climate related to heat than any other sort of weather impact across the country. And particularly in this area where we have such old infrastructure, we're going to be seeing exacerbated impacts from that. Next slide, please, Dira. So this slide gives some examples of that. This is showing the very heaviest precipitation event, the heaviest 1% of all precipitation storms from 1958 to 2012. And you can see the Northeast has seen by far the greatest impact, the greatest increase in those heaviest precipitation events, and that just continues. Okay, next slide. Thank you. And again, almost every single day, we're seeing something in the news about climate-related impacts, flooding, fire in California, and so forth. So sort of an aside here, people may be wondering, well, so why is a climate change, as a river organization, talking about climate resilience? Well, the work that CRWA has been doing for years and years, including in Franklin, related to improving water quality in the Charles River is very related to the steps that you would want to take to improve climate resilience. So what this slide shows is on the left, sort of natural, untouched by human, or at least untouched a lot by human intervention. What happens with precipitation is that when you have precipitation coming down, whether rain or snow, hail, etc., half of it infiltrates into the ground naturally. 10% runs off of the ground cover, and then 40% returns back to the environment, to the atmosphere from the soil, from the plants, and so forth. When you have a developed landscape, and this example is a relatively urbanized area, heavily urbanized area, you have a huge difference. Only 15% on average of the precipitation is infiltrating into the ground. Over half is leaving that ground cover as runoff, and that in an urbanized area is hitting your roads, your sidewalks, your buildings, and then going into the storm drains, or not when you have a massive flooding situation, but eventually carrying with it all of the toxins that are on our asphalt areas or impervious covers. And that's what's causing terrible water quality issues, one of the many causes, but one of the main causes in the Charles River. So that's work that we've been engaged in for many years. The nice co-benefit of when you're addressing the water quality from these impermeable surface sources, you're also often addressing flooding and heat. So we have a nice co-benefit, and it's one of the reasons that we are so passionate on climate resilience. We want to protect our communities. We're looking out for the entire watershed, but it's also very related to the work that we've already been doing for a long time. Next one, and I know, sorry, it's Robert changing slides on Jira. And this one, just to give you an example of where Franklin fits in terms of impervious surface. Basically, for the reasons I just described in the previous slide, anywhere you have a community with more impervious surface, you're going to have more impacts to the water quality in the Charles, and you're going to have more risk of flooding. So Franklin is kind of in the middle here. If you look at Sherburne, it's basically a lot of trees, not a lot of impervious cover there in comparison. And then on the other side of the scale, you have Somerville, close to 80% impervious cover. So a lot of issues with heat, a lot of issues with flooding. And so Franklin, in comparison, not as much, but it does mean wherever you're highly more urbanized areas with more impervious cover, you're going to see more of the impacts that we're talking about. And this slide just shows sort of what I was just talking about before, what the sources of stormwater runoff are, and why we work so hard. And we have been working so hard with Franklin on nutrient pollution, because these are the sources that are causing pollution in the Charles now, more than, say, especially in your part of the Charles, more than, say, sewage, the way it was back in the day. And this is March 2010. Some of you, or maybe all of you, may remember that historic storm where you had historic flooding in many communities in the Charles River watershed, including Franklin. And this is what we're going to be seeing more of in the future. And this is why we're here today, to be talking to particularly local, we're happy with everyone who's here, but particularly local leaders who are in a position to change, to implement projects and to change policies in such a way to prevent these impacts, or to at least mitigate these impacts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dira.
Thanks, Emily. So the slide that we have up here, I just really kind of want to show exactly what Emily was talking about. This is a a map of our entire watershed on the left-hand side, where you see impervious surfaces in gray throughout the watershed. Like we said, in our lower watershed, where you have Somerville and Cambridge, you see more of that impervious surfaces. And with climate change, we are expecting more rain and storm events, and we will be getting more intense rain than we already do, which can lead to that runoff. And for many of our municipalities, there will also be more severe flooding. And so the map on the right-hand side shows you kind of the correlation between the impervious surfaces and where flooding is a vulnerability. So the darker blue and the darker kind of maroon is where you see a combination of more impervious surfaces that will lead to higher susceptibility to flood and also just, increased vulnerability to the communities there. So obviously you see more of that in the lower watershed, but where you see in the upper watershed, it's typically where you find your town centers. That's the most impervious area that you typically find in an upper and middle watershed. Next slide, Robert. Actually pass this off to Robert.
Sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit, but Dira talked about the present day, but we're going to go back in time to sort of see how we got to this point. So back in history, you can see this map on the left is from 1735, and it's Bellingham on the left and Franklin's in the middle. And this is Grantham on the side, and this is in 1876. Franklin, as you can see, back in the 1700s, there was very little development. You can see the meandering streams of Mine Brook and Shepherd's Brook, and also the Charles River. And we're going to zoom into Mine Brook in 1832. You can see here's a tributary to Mine Brook, and that's current location sort of near the high school in Franklin. You can see there's a lot more impervious cover. So we have done more development, and there's more underground, and it goes underground right near where the high school is. And over time, we've had increased impervious surfaces, which has caused more of the stormwater pollution and flooding in other areas. So it's just sort of context of how we got there. And Emily mentioned this, but kind of going into further, we have had a long-standing relationship with the town of Franklin. We've worked on various projects. For example, we did the stormwater management plan for Spruce Brook Pond subwatershed. This is before my time at CRWA, but that was to help reduce nutrient pollution in the river and in town, to help with MS4 permit, but also out of that, we actually had some projects, including a rain garden at the Parameter Elementary School. I'm definitely butchering that name, I apologize, but at the elementary school. And also, Franklin is still involved in our Charles River Climate Compact and is working actively in collaboration with the 23 other towns in the compact on a flood model project, as you see on the map on the right, to find out areas where more flooding will occur with climate change. And Dira will go into that more as we go along. I'm going to pass it back to Dira to talk about Natural Valley Storage Area.
Thanks, Robert. So another example of how CRWA has been involved with Franklin is with the NVSA, or the Natural Valley Storage Area, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So this is that 8,100 acre network of protected wetlands across 16 communities, a watershed that has the power to store floodwaters, act as a habitat, and create, an area for people who like boating and fishing and enjoying nature in general. And we continue working within Franklin and the NVSA by studying the health of the NVSA. We actually recently, in the last year, did a fish survey with the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife last year, just to look at the types of fish that we could find there, and also the sizes of the fish. Next slide. So you may be wondering how the NVSA actually came about and what its important in our watershed is. So back in August 1955, we actually experienced two hurricanes Connie and Diane. And during this event, Massachusetts basically received 20 inches of rain in 2 days, which still holds the record for the wettest hurricane to hit Massachusetts. And it affected the entire East Coast from North Carolina to Massachusetts. And we saw about 100,000 New Englanders losing their job from flooded mills and factories. And this was the first hurricane to cost us more than $1 billion. And so this got the government thinking about flood mitigation, and they looked at NVSA as a flood strategy, in parts due to CRWA advocating to conserve those wetlands. And in terms of climate resiliency, the NVSA puts Franklin, kind of ahead of many other municipalities because it already has a natural storage facility to help mitigate some of the major floods. And it also helps protect downstream Franklin from flooding as well. So since then, and in the past few years, we know that Franklin has gone through the process of identifying top hazards for the town. So back in November 2019, next slide, Bellingham and Franklin had a community resilience building workshop to build your MVP or your municipal vulnerability preparedness plan, which through this process built upon Franklin's established FEMA hazard mitigation plan. And this is an important plan to maintain because the status of this ensures that your town is eligible for state MVP action grant funding, which can then help you fund climate resiliency projects and even emergency responsiveness. So to cover just some of the findings, the top hazards that was reported in your MVP report include flooding, severe storms, drought, and extreme heat. The top 3 priority actions based on the stakeholder feedback included improving emergency shelters and transportation, improving your communication systems to your residents, especially your vulnerable populations, and also water resource protection and planning. As we know, Franklin depends on wells for water supply. We also know that you've reviewed and updated your stormwater regs to manage stormwater better, which is really exciting for us to see. And like I just mentioned, the town also has a hazard mitigation plan, which is related to the MVP plan in that it looks at natural hazards. And you have identified brush fire as a risk for parts of your town, especially the wooded areas near the Interstate 495. It also notes that the vast majority of your federal disaster claims in the March 2010 flood in Franklin, about 99% of that flooding actually occurred outside of the national FEMA flood zone. And so we know, because we have seen flooding happening outside of those designated zones, and with climate change and intensifying storm events, that your town should be preparing and adapting for future flooding, even outside of those zones. And then other things, we know that you're upgrading and increasing your capacity for your culverts and stream crossings, as well as developing a beaver management plan, which is unique to your town. Next slide. So you know your top hazards, and you've also identified your vulnerable populations that may be at a higher risk from the flooding and the drought and the intense storms as your older population. And many of them actually live alone. As well as your low-income residents, your people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness. These are populations in your community that may experience exacerbated impacts of climate change due to various economic or social factors. And Franklin does have 2 state-designated environmental justice communities in the center of your town, which is highlighted in this red circle here. And if you zoom in a little bit closer, you'll see that this yellow one is designated for minority, and then the green one is designated for minority and income. And we know that EJ communities are communities that historically have been most impacted and overburdened by environmental harms and risk. These communities are the ones that are more likely to host a toxic facility or have higher concentrations of pollution, or even at a higher risk for flooding. And in this case, your EJ neighborhoods are near the I-495, and so they might be more exposed to lower air quality and other pollutants. So these are populations that as a town, we put as a priority when thinking about climate change impacts and resiliency strategies. So I want to touch also briefly on some of the top hazards that was identified. So one of them was your extreme heat. A major climate change impact that happens in more urbanized areas or developed areas with extreme heat is what we call the urban heat island effect. And this essentially is a phenomenon of built up areas that experience higher air temperatures than its surrounding. So essentially an island of heat, and is caused by a number of things, including lack of green space and building height, which traps or adds heat and then traps the heat. And urban centers or town centers can experience between 1.8 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than your rural suburban counterparts. And the risk from this for your community includes that heat-related illness and mortality that Emily mentioned in the beginning, especially with your older population. Water pollution can also be an impact, and increased energy consumption and gas emissions. And for Franklin, in your MVP report, you've actually identified more than 10 hotspots in your town that experience this urban heat island effect. These are where you see the lowest tree cover and the highest impervious surfaces in gray on this map. Many of your hotspots are also located in your state designated EJ communities that you see in the red box. So these are also where you may have workers who primarily work outside, like construction workers or landscapers, who may be more at risk to heat illnesses. So these might also be areas where resiliency projects could have the most benefit for your town. Another thing that your MVP report looked at is flooding. And so the MVP report shows the designated flooding zones by FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And through that process, stakeholders that participated also identified these 4 areas listed here as areas that experience flooding that are not necessarily represented on the FEMA flood zone maps, which is reflective of that March 2010 flood that occurred outside most of the FEMA flood zones. And then lastly, we want to acknowledge that as you're thinking about all these different things, that the Water Management Act is also a critical factor in your decision-making process, because Franklin depends or has local drinking water that comes from 13 town-owned groundwater supply wells. And we know that the Water Management Act regulates water withdrawals to ensure sufficient quality and quantity for water. We also know that the Water Management Act is going through a review process, which we are actively participating in. And as listed in your MVP top hazards, drought is a climate change impact concern for Franklin. And with droughts getting worse, your groundwater supply is also being stressed. So what is Franklin already doing to address some of those concerns? So we know that Franklin has done many things for climate resiliency and is already kind of a leader in this effort. The town is installing rain gardens, reducing paved surfaces, and increasing outreach to your community members about pollution. You also have a stormwater utility on the books and are looking to set a fee rate, which could help fund some of your stormwater management projects. Your town is also designated as a green community in 2018, and you're doing many things to increase clean energy, transportation, and energy efficiency. So all working towards a more sustainable future. As Robert mentioned, Franklin is also an active member of the Climate Compact Group, which is a group founded in 2019 that brings Charles River watershed communities together to work on climate adaptation by sharing information and taking on regional and watershed-wide views of adaptation strategies. One of the major project items that came out of that group is the Watershed Modeling project, which is funded by an MVP action grant, and it was to create a computer model that predicts where flooding will occur under future climate scenarios. And it also identifies and tests how different nature-based solutions can reduce flooding impacts in the upper and middle watershed. And I want to show you guys this comparison. The map on the left is a screenshot of what a 2070 10-year 24-hour storm would look like in Franklin near the Financial Park area. Note that there is that flooding that goes right across one of the roads. And then the screenshot on the right-hand side is the same storm event, but if you were to install green stormwater infrastructure on 20% of feasible land, you see that there is a reduction of flooding in that gigantic area where the roads are. Another example is, this is a screenshot of what a 2070 10-year 24-hour storm would look like again. Note that you have these flooding that's happening where these houses and roads are, and that it's over 3 feet of water depth in this area. We've also found out that about a foot of water will actually float away many vehicles, and 2 feet of rushing water can carry away a lot of vehicles as well. So this, the difference in the feet can matter to you and your houses and cars. This one is the same storm event, but if you were to install green infrastructure. So want to note the reduction of water depth in that area. So about a foot reduction in some areas. And then in that bottom where the 0 feet is, you actually see no flooding at all. And if you take the watershed modeling and look at a town-wide flooding view, note that there is flooding all along the Charles River, so riverine flooding. You have flooding in, I believe, Populatic Pond again, Mine Brook and Shepherd's Brook. And so these are all potential focus sites for the Climate Compact to look at for phase 2 of this project, because we are starting to move from the planning phase to the action phase. So really identifying sites in different parts of the watershed to implement that stormwater management projects. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to Robert.
Awesome. Thank you, dear. I was just trying to figure out how to unmute. So there are a lot of different opportunities for Franklin to help increase climate resilience from, infrastructure side, but also from the policy side. And I'm going to talk about both of those. I'm going to start off with another poll. Second poll for the night is about climate adaptation. What is the biggest challenge to implement climate adaptation measures or projects in your community? I can't see the poll, so if you somebody wants to narrate it.
Yeah, the poll should be up. I don't see any responses quite yet. Oh, there we go. So we got about 3 responses in. It looks like some of the biggest challenges to implementing climate change adaptations. The top answer right now is funding. Next is staff capacity. And then the followings are constituent support and expertise.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for participating. The second question is, do you have regular communication with your upstream and downstream neighbors about climate change adaptation? I know Franklin does, but folks in the room, if you do or don't, because I know we have some residents too.
So it looks like people have responded mostly no and some yes sometimes to that answer.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. So when we were talking about our work and advocating to help, we're talking about helping build so-called nature-based solutions, which include all the things listed on the screen here, including green streets, bioretention, porous pavement. These are things that Franklin is doing, as well as restoration projects like stream restoration, wetlands restoration, dam removal, as well as other things. And Franklin, like I said, is doing a lot of these things, but there's always more opportunities to do more. And communities throughout the watershed benefit from these best management practices. And as you can see here, some more pictures of some rain gardens in Franklin, and here's some other ones around the watershed. In one way, we identify some projects for nature-based solutions like natural wetlands and protecting forests is through our conservation tool we developed in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. And this is designed for urban and developed areas, including places like Franklin. And you can use this tool on our website to filter for land use, critical habitat, environmental justice, flood risk, which is historic and projected, as well as infrastructure. And this tool generates priority areas to conserve or restore to enable climate change scenario analysis and planning at the watershed level. And like I said, it's on our website, and we ran the tool here on the right. And as you can see, this is for inland flood hazard for in inland flood conservation opportunities. And in the darker shades of purple highlighted here show some opportunities for areas that you could conserve through property acquisition or through conservation restrictions. If you're not already doing this, this includes areas around Mine Brook, downstream of the Natural Valley Storage Area and the protected areas in green, as well as this area around Shepherd's Brook, which is a cold water fishery, which has some native brook trout. And this is around Populatic Pond. There's some more opportunities there as well. So another, and I know there's some folks on the call who are interested in dams, but another nature-based solution that we look at to help build climate resilience is to explore removal of dams that are currently not serving a purpose. And many dams, including the majority of the Charles River, were built almost a century ago or more to power the Industrial Revolution and currently serve no purpose. But there are some dams on the Charles River and in Massachusetts that do serve purposes, including the New Charles Dam in Boston, which is a flood control dam, which regulates the level of the lower basin. We're not going to advocate for removing dams like that because they're never going to come out and they're protecting areas, as well as water supply dams, including Echo Lake and Hopkinton, which is upstream of Franklin, which is owned by the Milford Water Company, which supplies water for the town of Milford. So that obviously is not going to go away anytime soon. And there are the other dams, majority of them are former mill dams, which are aging structures, and they were built a time before knowledge of climate change. They were not built for these extreme storms, flooding, and higher precipitation levels. And with all of this changes, there becomes more potential for more dam safety threats. And at Sierra de Bois, we're looking at dams throughout the watershed, including old mill dams to look at as potential candidates for removal. And you may be wondering, so are dams bad for the environment? I mean, a lot of them are beautiful and iconic looking. Think about South Natick Dam on the Charles River, Sanford Mill Dam. I've been on the bridge there. It's really an iconic structure. The sad story is they are bad for the environment. They degrade the water quality in the so-called mill pond behind the dam because the water is slowed down, and that causes temperatures to increase and also lowers dissolved oxygen levels, which is not good for the fish and other aquatic species behind the dam. Additionally, sediment is backed up and accumulates, as well as nutrients behind the dam, because it gets trapped there and it's not able to pass freely downstream. And that can degrade the bottom or benthic habitat for fish and other aquatic species like turtles. Additionally, these dams are blocking all of the passage of aquatic fish like migratory fish, as well as resident fish like trout. I talked about this, some cold water fisheries, and the fish can't move because there's a big wall, essentially. And you may be wondering, is there precedent for dam removal on the Charles River? The answer is yes. Back in 2017, the town of Bellingham removed the old mill dam and restored another section of the river. And a total of 10 dams have been breached or removed on the main stem of the Charles River since colonization. And currently we have 19 dams on the Charles River. So you may be wondering, will dam removal improve the health of the river? And the answer is yes. Removing dams, you improve water quality by increasing the amount of oxygen in the water and lowering temperatures, which is great for fish and other wildlife. You want the water to be moving rather than being stagnant in the pond. And as also you allow for more free flow of sediments throughout the system, which is good for allowing for more changes in the bottom of the river for those fish. Also for people, you eliminate any threat and liability of dam failure and costs associated with frequent dam inspections and dam repairs. You can also lower flooding upstream often, and often there's no changes to downstream. But those things are done, and they're studied in a feasibility study where they do hydraulic monitoring before you even consider removing a dam. And also, there are many grant opportunities in funding of dam removals versus dam repair. And this is a picture I took last week of the site in North Bellingham. You can see there's a lot more riparian areas. You can see more areas where the water can go in a flood. And it's really a beautiful site. You got a riffle here. Also for paddlers, you don't have to worry about getting trapped on top of the dam. You can go right through here, no problem. And this is off of Beach Street if people want to go. It's right in Bellingham. And there are 2 mill dams currently located on the main stem of the Charles River in Franklin on the Medway border. Currently, there are no plans to remove the following dams. However, CRWA is interested in exploring dam removal as well as other mill dams on the rest of the river. Sanford Mill Dam, as many of you all know, is an iconic 93-year-old structure owned by the defunct Mill Dam Management Company. It's currently rated in poor condition from a 2019 inspection report by the Office of Dam Safety's consultant, Pear Group. And there's no maintenance and no emergency management or evacuation plan for this dam. And that's required by law because the Mill Dam Management Company is defunct. There's nobody maintaining the dam, and taxpayers have to pay for that inspection because Office of Dam Safety paid for it. So it's a concern. Additionally, like I mentioned before, there's a cold water fishery upstream called Shepherd's Brook in Franklin. And if you were to remove the dam, you would be able to connect that to the largest free-flowing section of the Charles River, which is below this dam, which is 19.6 miles. Also, from the 2019 inspection report, they estimated that the private dam owner would be on the hook for from $407,000 to $1.4 million for dam repair versus $715,000 to $1.2 million for dam removal. And the thing is, there's not a lot of funding, like I said in the last slide, for dam repair. There's a lot more for dam removal because of all the co-benefits for recreation, being able to kayak directly through, as well as for the fisheries and the wildlife habitat and removing that structure for flooding. And then there's also a second mill dam upstream called the West Medway Dam, which is a 194-year-old low hazard potential structure, also in poor condition. It is also owned by a defunct corporation and has no known maintenance. And the last dam inspection of that we got from was in 1998. So that hasn't been inspected even longer. So something we got to look at as well. So those are the dams. Now I'm going to transition over to talk about some non-tangible projects to help improve climate resilience. So we have a climate resilience toolkit, which is on our website at crwa.org/toolkit, which we talk about policy solutions to help increase resilience. And we identified that Franklin can improve their local wetlands bylaw and strengthen it to protect isolated wetlands and intermittent streams, which is not covered under state law. In addition, you can opt in and look into following Arlington and Boston and require that provide language that states that climate change is a reason for wetlands protection. And that can help increase the power of the Conservation Commission to consider climate change adaptation, flooding, and heat islands in their decision making. So it's a good tool. And on our toolkit on our website, we have ways that you can and language that you can adopt if you choose to do so. We're not saying you have to do it, but it's something that would be good for the river and good for residents. Additionally, as we don't recognize trees as such, they're really a critical piece of infrastructure. They help with climate change adaptation, as my colleagues have said. They reduce air, improve air quality, reduce noise, pollution, and heat island effects, and mitigate flooding and erosion. And they also sequester carbon through, photosynthesis, increase property values and community aesthetic. And Franklin currently has a tree protection bylaw on the books, but it only protects public property, doesn't protect private property. So if Franklin's interested, they could go in and expand it like Somerville and Lexington have done for private property so that you can have more regulations over private property to protect more trees. Additionally, we mentioned this, but Stormwater Utility is another great tool in the toolkit, and we know that you all have one on the books. And the next step would be to set a fee utility rate, which would be awesome to sort of start getting that revenue for these projects. And you're not alone. 23 communities in the Commonwealth already have it. I'm not going to go through the list, but my hometown of Braintree is a member, and so I could connect you to folks there if you're interested. And lastly, we have information about how to look through your hazard mitigation plan, your climate plan, and open space plans to help strengthen it or just learn more about it. We can help support you on that, the toolkit. And wrapping up, also we have information from the US EPA. Franklin is under a mandate for reducing phosphorus pollution by 35% to go and be in compliance with the TMDL, or the pollution budget for the river. This was a mandate, unfunded mandate from EPA, and that will help further clean up the river and reduce harmful algal blooms and cyanobacteria blooms that we see in areas of the river. And Franklin is really on the cutting edge in doing these nature-based solutions to green infrastructure to help comply with this, but a lot more is needed to be done. So this is sort of like the what's lingering in the background. And good thing is, I want to share some recent funding opportunities that have come into play. We got the American Rescue Plan, or ARPA. You hear that acronym ARPA, it's the American Rescue Plan, which is a new law. It's not that new, but we're starting to get the funding from the federal government, $8.7 billion to state and local governments. And these funds have been distributed, and CRWA is helping advocate for more money to go towards these nature-based solutions and towards the cities and towns for the MVP program. And also we got the infrastructure law, and there's going to be more funds coming to the state revolving fund for infrastructure projects for water and sewer and for these sort of stormwater initiatives. And there's money coming from municipalities, the state, but also there's money going through the county. And I believe you're in Norfolk County, so that's another way funding is coming through. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the rest of those opportunities, but there are a bunch of others. And Franklin, grant matches, you could use your staff time and leverage things. We can talk more. So I'm going to pass it back to Dira.
Thanks, Robert. So before we get into our discussion and Q&A, we just want to end with a summary slide of some of the recommendations that we have mentioned throughout the presentation for Franklin. So one of them is to continue considering, the land conservation opportunities that are available in Franklin, and building and installing more green infrastructures or green stormwater infrastructures into your area to increase flood mitigation opportunities. You could update your wetlands and tree bylaw so that it could protect more of that private trees and help mitigate different top hazards like that you've identified, like your extreme heat. You could continue to pass your stormwater utility free rate, and that could also help fund a sustainability coordinator position to add capacity to your staff members working on energy and environmental issues. So just some of the recommendations that we mentioned, but now we would like to open it up to the audience for any questions or comments that you may have.
Yeah, and folks can feel free to, just speak out, or if you want to be more orderly about it, we can use the raise hand feature. And, but yeah, would love to, obviously we just threw a ton of information at you. Hopefully you found it helpful, but yeah, really want to hear, would love to hear from everyone, but particularly the town councilors. Would love to hear your thoughts and, about what you heard and how we can be helpful.
Are you muted, Emily? Yeah, Melanie, go ahead.
Hi, I threw a couple questions into the chat. We're in the process, Franklin is in the process of downtown rezoning. So what priority green infrastructure should we be thinking about including in that zoning? Also, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the Shepherd's Brook conservation opportunities and how that would help. And I'm sure there's a ton of more things out there. Kobe's out there too, so. Thank you.
Robert or Jerry, you want to jump on that?
So the first one I believe was about just zoning different and thinking about different infrastructure for towns. So some of the examples that we've seen towns do is incorporating more green streets or generally just green streets. So more of that bioretention or rain garden along the streets where you would experience more localized flooding that could help mitigate that. We've also suggested to many communities, because it also gives an educational benefit, is to where you might think for locations of rain gardens is your schools or your libraries. Those are some really great opportunity spots to add the GI installations. Would you like to add anything, Robert?
Yeah, other things, I think when we think of impervious cover, often think about parking lots. So however you can reduce the amount of parking, lots, that can help in having more green space would be helpful. It's one thing. I don't have a specific bylaw recommendation, but I think generally speaking, more opportunities for green infrastructure, more opportunities for that. More walkability would be good, just, general environment. That helps. I know there's a commuter rail stop, so that's good for transit oriented development, that sort of thing.
But I think this is a point that both Robert and Dira made, but I think it's worth shouting out. In March 2010, the vast majority of flood claims, not just in Franklin, but in many other places in Massachusetts too, were in areas outside the FEMA flood map area. So yes, that means that flooding's happening where it wasn't. It also means you can't rely on FEMA flood maps. So I think a really big one is just make sure that your municipal staff who are wonderful. We're working with them on the climate compact, and you saw some photos in there where I took a tour with your DPW director and other staff with our deputy director Julie Wood probably a couple months ago at this point to see so your green infrastructure installations in Franklin. But just make sure that they're using updated climate data and not like, oh, well, this area hasn't flooded before, so we can put a ton of more impervious surface everywhere. Really should be the other way. And another thing I was thinking, looking at the slides, sort of with fresh eyes, pretending I'm all of you. I think we can look at 2070 storms and think, oh, well, that's a long time away. But when you think of when we're approving development and making decisions, it's not just for the next 5 or 10 years. It is for decades in the future. And 50 years from now, like my kids will be in middle age, like your grandchildren will be in their prime. So we're actually making decisions now that will affect people that we care about, even if it seems like a long time ago or a long time in the future, it's really not so much. And so what are the decisions, even if the worst impacts are relatively far in the future, what decisions can we be making now that in 50 years, people are going to look back and be thankful that we made, just as we're thankful to those who set aside parks and natural spaces that we can all enjoy.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the that's the whole thing about being on the council and doing things, working with people like you guys is more about what at least 10 years from now is going to look like. So 10 years and beyond is kind of my, I get really like, I want it to happen now, but it's like, it doesn't work that way. So we have to think about what do we want everything to see. I do have another question about the Shepherd's Brook conservation potential, but also since Populatic Pond did flood, like what about if we remove that dam? That's upstream, then it goes through the stream and into Populatic Pond, down the Charles, and down into, I think, what is that, Norfolk, right? So it goes through and into Norfolk. I've kayaked that a lot. I think some of that area gets kind of low in the droughty times, but I was like, would that area reflood because of that dam not being there? I mean, what is the con about removing a dam from what we see today is another
Yeah.
question.
That's a good question. And with respect to that, a lot of these dams and first of all, you would want to have a feasibility study before you can see, you look at it. So in the feasibility study, they would have, engineers look at the dam and do hydraulic modeling and look at, would there be decrease in flooding, would there not? So that they'd look into that. But from our experience looking at the feasibility study at Watertown Dam, a lot of these old mill dams are run a river dam. So it's not like a flood control structure like you see at New Charles, where it's not like holding a bunch of water back. All the water coming in the mill pond is leaving the mill pond. So it's like a bowl. You fill up a bowl and the water just fills over the bowl. So it's not holding the floodwaters back. So there would not be downstream impacts.
So if the dam all of a sudden like loose, then there would be a much greater impact.
Yeah, that's
true?
dam breach. Yeah. So that's, say they don't continue to not maintain the dam and it gets worse and there is a breach, that's like a big tidal wave. That's what we're really concerned about in a flood. It's in poor condition. It's not the worst condition. There's a lower rating for dams called unsafe. For those two, they're just poor. So it could be worse, but all of these dams, we want to look at, are they being maintained? They should be, or if the cost is more, why don't we look at removal? I mean, the good thing is for Franklin and Medway, both of those dams are not owned by the town. So the town and the taxpayers in the towns will not have to pay to repair or remove the dams. It's on the private dam owner, which is a good thing. It's a little more complicated with the Sanford because of the defunct corporation, but and we're still learning about that because it's kind of weird. It's sort of DCR dam safety. Like they have their own investigative side and they go hunt and find and sue the dam owners essentially to help force them to do things about it, repair the dams or have
Does that dam cause flooding upstream when we get a ton of rain?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know because I'm not an engineer, so I wouldn't want to speculate, but I know from the example in Watertown Dam, which is a run-of-river dam, they'd see a decrease in 6 feet up to a half mile upstream, not 6 feet at a half a mile, but like tapered down. So there would be a decrease.
If the dam were removed.
Yeah, and water, that's the water specific. My guess is probably a similar, but that's, I don't want to hypothesize, but it's definitely something that if there were going to be a feasibility study, they would look at that. And that's before, that's just feasibility. That's just looking into, should we remove it? What's the obstacles? What's that? And
Right.
generally,
So it's not like we already know that we need to like do this feasibility study that you're talking about and then make sure we know the pros and cons of everything. And that hasn't been done yet.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then your last question about the brook,
Yeah.
Robert.
Shepherd's Brook area. You mentioned that. I don't.
Yeah. So Shepherd's Brook. So when I ran the conservation tool, there were areas on Shepherd's Brook that could be, they were in that priority for flooding. I don't have the specific parcel numbers, but there are opportunities to either have a conservation restriction. I don't know if the town already has one or if the Army Corps does, but it seems like there could potentially be opportunities to look at that. And like I said, that is a cold water fishery, which is really cool. They have wild trout, and it's pretty rare to have that in Eastern Mass. You get a lot of them in Western Mass. So it's kind of a cool resource. And the other thing is there's another trout stream. I know I'm kind of going on the fish wagon, but there's one downstream of the big 19 miles, go past the dam in South Natick, which they're, considering removing. That's in the process. there's another couple brooks in Dover that are down there, but they're separated by the two dams, unfortunately, at the moment. See, we got some things in the chat, and we want to recognize the time.
Okay, thanks.
Alan,
Okay.
did you have your hand up?
Mute. He said, mention 55 flood.
Yeah, I can. When you start out, you began talking about the 1958 to 2020 period and the worsening flooding, but you didn't mention the previous 30 years when we had horrendous flooding, although Jura did mention 55. So I'm wondering, would that have altered your conclusions if you included the data from the previous earlier 20 or so years? And then I also
No.
wonder whether you ever
Yeah,
worked
we
with the Small
just
Hydro
chose,
Institute.
yeah, and just to that, we just chose that one particular, yeah, I know there's a, probably good for everyone else to mute. We just chose that one particular data, point. It's a nice slide. It's very, there's so much more. We could have been throwing slide after slide with data about flooding and precipitation levels in Massachusetts and river levels in the Charles. So I don't think that choosing a different time period would make anyone in Massachusetts, anyone who's in leadership in a decision-making position should not, I don't think the responsible thing to do would be to sit back and be like, no, I think we're good. The climate science is pretty firm, very firm on the
But the
precipitation.
conclusions would be
increasing.
opposite. You're sort of cooking the books, I think,
No, what we're
by
saying is
not
that
including a
precipitation
longer
is-
time frame.
like I just said, we could have shown data in a different way that the conclusion is that precipitation is increasing. And this wasn't,
No,
we didn't.
it's not.
So if I could just answer.
It's actually the opposite.
So if I could just address a little bit more,
Please.
what we were trying to do here today was really target this at local decision makers in Franklin. Starting with the assumption that climate change is real and that the impacts that climate scientists say are here and are coming are also real, and just go from there. There are other forums where we can debate these other things. Tonight was really not for that. And I can tell you quite personally, I came to CRWA 3.5 years ago, and I was very passionate about this concept of having this conversation with local leaders, because I saw with my other hat on as a city councilor in Newton that I didn't have the information that I needed to be asking questions and making decisions. So really, that's what this is about. There are other forums where we can debate. I probably wouldn't attend those, but where one can debate climate science. But I think for local officials, they really don't have the luxury of doing that. They're responsible for the safety of their residents. And so they really can't roll the dice and be like, well, let's just hope 99.999% of climate science is wrong and that everything's just going to be the same. So that's the chip we have on our shoulder about this work, and hoping that will be useful for Councillor Hamblin, for Councillor Fongilla, who would also love to hear from.
And my other question was, do you ever work with or have you worked with the Small Hydro Institute?
I want to say that sounds familiar, but I don't have anything off the top of my head that we're working on right now.
Yeah. And a lot of these dams, it's not really financially feasible to do hydro. There's a lot of it out in Western Mass. I've, went to UMass Amherst. I've seen the Holyoke Dam and the dams on the Connecticut River. It's a lot bigger drop. So, and I think the benefits from ecological and for being able to paddle downstream is a lot better than, trying to keep these structures that aren't being maintained. I think we're getting a little echo here, but yeah, so I think that makes sense. I know, any other questions? I know Linda had some questions on email. I don't know if you want to speak offline or if you had any questions for tonight, Linda. Oop.
I guess the only thing, I obviously listened in. I live at the Sanford Mill. It's difficult to hear what you're saying regarding the dam that we love. But one question I did have, I'm just going to look at my phone real quick, in regards to the slide with the Bellingham Old Mill Dam removal.
Yep.
So I am not familiar with that property. But when I took a picture of that and I was kind of examining the water, and in this picture, it does not look very deep and it does not look very wide, but it's very difficult to obviously tell through a picture. Do you have any idea of what it was prior to the removal of the dam, the width? Because you had stated that, oh, kayaking can be great, but looking at this photo, it looks like you would be bottoming out. And I did a lot of research today looking at the Massachusetts, the EPA study on the Massachusetts climate, where they were saying that the expectation is in the fall and the winter to have flooding, and in the summer and the spring to have droughts. So, looking at this particular picture and kind of saying, maybe somewhere in the future, that's going to now be my backyard. And, nature chooses the way it's going to go. We can have all the greatest plans and then wind up having our rivers completely gone. Our rivers turn to streams, and then there isn't enough water. Again, just looking at that, obviously I'm not an expert. It's just my feeling. I really spent today, I contacted the Massachusetts River Drought Alliance, just trying to get more information. I look at, and I'm sorry to keep talking, but I am very kind of passionate about this. I look at the river today and I see all the inhabitants. Today I was looking at 4 ducks floating and imagining it turning into a stream. I'm saying those ducks are going to be bottoming out. I kayak nearly every weekend in the summer and the spring. I'm looking at the turtles. I look at, when I'm going out on the water, I'm seeing the freshwater crabs, there's snails. I just feel like it's going to be just a mass die-off.
All right. Yeah. So thank you, Linda. That was a really helpful comment. We've had lots of interesting and helpful interactions with the various folks in the various communities where we're working on dam removal. That is a very small piece of this particular evening. I am wondering if we could connect with you on our dam removal work. Another way, we could even set up a time for the folks who live, in your housing unit to have a conversation about the ecological benefits from our perspective, the risks and so forth, and have much more of a deep dive, so to speak, on that issue. Would that be helpful?
Well, I don't want to sound like a horrible person, and I love the planet and all that. And I live here. It is why I moved here. I couldn't even afford to move anywhere else with this. And I know that a lot of people feel that way. It's like, this is our home, our backyard. And I know that this project and everything, you're impacting other people. I don't know how you would feel if it was your backyard. And
So Linda, I'm going to cut you off right there. We would
Yeah.
love to engage in this. Tonight is really not about
I'm
that.
sorry. I know.
Franklin, would love to, absolutely, would love to really engage with you about that, because these are places that are so important, particularly to the people who are closest to them. So we just want to, have a conversation about it, but let's do it at a time when.
Yeah, I apologize. Like I said,
Okay.
it's
All right. Thank you. I want to see if Councillor Frangillo had anything to add or ask as another councillor in Franklin. And if not, then we could probably, because we're well after 8 o'clock.
And I do have a couple, I can answer her question after that and offer tomorrow's night's event too. I think Linda has it though.
Okay.
Sorry.
No questions from me, but I'm super happy that you guys put this together for us. This has been fantastic, and I've had the luxury of answering or asking most of my questions to Rob over the past few weeks. So if any other questions do come up, I know where to find you. But the big thing for me is, can you please get us that recording? Because I'd love to share this with some of my fellow municipal leaders.
Happy to, happy to. And we are happy to also sit down with people, you know, again, one-on-one, because they might watch and have more questions, and it's, you know, it's a recording. So happy to, I mean, we're really here to serve you all. So you're helping us and we're trying to help you. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.